The night had a life of its own. The air felt different here, thicker, as if the very atmosphere carried the weight of forgotten centuries. Cold winds swept through the empty streets, swirling the dry leaves into endless dance. Above, a jagged moon hung low, casting a ghostly light over the stone buildings, their walls weary from centuries of battle and strife. The village had fallen into a restless slumber. Yet here, on the edge of the darkness, stood a lone figure, a man whose name would never be known. His cloak hung heavy against his shoulders, damp with the cold mist that now clung to the earth. The flicker of a dying lantern illuminated his weathered face, eyes sharp, alert, and filled with the heavy knowledge of what lurked in the shadows. His breath was shallow, and each inhale seemed to draw the chill deeper into his chest. A soft creak echoed underfoot as he shifted, eyes scanning the dimly lit corners of the square, where forgotten whispers drifted like the smoke of a fire long extinguished. This was no ordinary man, no simple guardian of walls or gates. He was the night watchman, the last line of defense against the unknown that crept into the world when the sun set. His task was not one of glory or honor. There would be no medals, no songs sung of his sacrifices. His duty was born of necessity, and it was bound to the ancient, unspoken pact between man and the encroaching darkness. A pact forged in the bowels of history, when death had no name and terror lived just beyond the hearth's glow. His spear, worn smooth by years of use, seemed almost an extension of his own body. He gripped it with both hands, the metal cold beneath his fingers, its weight a constant reminder of the responsibility he bore. The shadows around him were thick, alive with the promise of danger, the unknown. Every crack in the cobblestone, every rustle in the trees, every passing breeze that stirred the dry leaves felt like a harbinger, a warning that the quiet was but the calm before the storm. The watchman stepped forward, his boots crunching softly in the wet earth. The silence was overwhelming. Beneath the cloak of darkness, the world seemed suspended between life and death, suspended between the moment before the end of the world. The distant howls of wolves echoed faintly in the night, a sound that was almost too natural to be heard by human ears, yet felt in the deepest parts of the soul. A sound both haunting and ancient. A shiver ran down his spine as he pulled his cloak tighter around him, his mind drifting briefly to the whispers of those who had come before him, the ones whose faces were forgotten by time, whose names had long been erased from the books of history. He could almost hear them now, their voices carried on the wind, warnings, tales of terror that had shaped the very foundation of this village. Their fears had become his own. The plague, bandits, the wild things that roamed the forests. But worse, far worse than any of these, was the weight of the unknown, the thing that slipped in quietly, unseen, and left only the cold aftertaste of its presence. He could feel it now, a creeping sense of dread, like a thick fog that had settled into his bones. The night was far more than a mere absence of light. It was a presence all its own, filled with danger, with madness. And yet, he had no choice but to stand guard. The world beyond these walls was dangerous, filled with disease, famine, and the ever-present threat of invasion. But the dangers inside were just as deadly. He could feel them, like knives poised to strike, and he stood there, resolute, watching for any sign of movement in the streets, his eyes scanning every shadow. Each hour that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last, the stillness growing thicker, suffocating. The villages behind him slept, blissfully unaware of the dangers lurking just beyond their reach. The warm glow of their hearths, the soft sounds of children's laughter, the scent of bread baking. These were the comforts they took for granted. For the night watchman, there was only the darkness and the fear that it brought with it. He knew that it would not be long before the others awoke, before they resumed their lives, unaware of the silent sentinels who held the line between them and the unknown. The watchman paused as he heard a rustling in the distance. His heart skipped a beat, his grip tightening on his spear. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of burning wood, of something more dangerous, something wrong. He turned toward the woods that bordered the village, his gaze narrowing, eyes straining to make out anything in the distance. A shadow moved, too swift to be natural. Was it a man? A beast? His thoughts raced, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, swallowed by the trees. The watchman's breath came out in a slow exhale, his body releasing the tension that had built in his muscles. Another hour passed, but it felt like days had gone by since he had first taken his place in the square. His mind was heavy with the weight of his solitude. He was a ghost in a land of the living, unseen and unheard. There was no one to witness his efforts, no one to know the price he paid each night to keep them safe. It was a burden, one born out of love for a world that had never asked him to bear it. And yet, there was a sense of peace in his vigilance. Though the weight of it all threatened to crush him, the night watchman felt the quiet hum of purpose within him. The wind howled, the wolves called, the darkness pressed in closer still, but he remained. He had no choice. His oath was a promise, and promises were never broken, not even in the face of the darkest fears. His duty was eternal. The first rays of dawn broke through the heavy mist, casting long shadows across the village. The watchman's stance shifted, his shoulders loosening, his grip on his spear softening. The night had passed, but it would return again as it always did. The villagers, now stirring from their sleep, would never know the sacrifices he had made, the quiet horror he had endured. But he would remember, always. The world would forget him, but he would not forget the darkness, and in that, he would find his place in this forgotten world. As the sun rose, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the faint echo of his footsteps, a silent testament to the men who had stood before, who had stood between life and death, in the name of a duty that no one would ever see. And the village for another day would be safe, silent, unaware, but safe. The night watchman, though forgotten by all but the wind, would continue his solitary watch until the darkness called again. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale crescent barely visible through the thick cloak of mist that had settled over the village. The air felt unnaturally still, almost as if the very earth was holding its breath. A faint rustle stirred the trees at the edge of the woods, but all was silent. The wind had abandoned its usual song, leaving only the distant sound of a bell tolling, its deep, mournful cry echoing through the streets, a reminder of the passage of time in a world that could not afford to forget its past. At the center of the village, the watchman stood alone, his back pressed against the stone wall of the square. His face, obscured by the shadow of his hood, was barely visible in the dying light of his lantern. The flame flickered, casting brief, haunting shadows that danced across the cold stone, and for a moment the village seemed to vanish. Only he remained, silent, isolated, a solitary figure in a world that could not afford to wait. His hands gripped the haft of his spear, fingers raw from years of service, as his eyes scanned the square, each corner, each alleyway, each stretch of wall that might conceal the world's many threats. The shadows seemed to whisper, the night's emptiness pressing in upon him. Here, at the edge of the village, on the cusp of a world long lost to time, the watchman stood between civilization and the abyss. The coldness in the air wrapped itself around him, settling into his very bones. But it was not the cold that made his heart beat faster, nor the fleeting chill of a wind that swept through the empty streets. It was the weight of his responsibility. He was the one who stood guard against the things that crept through the cracks in the world, unseen, unheard, but always waiting. He had been born to this duty, raised within the hollow promise that this vigil would be his life. And yet, in the stillness of the night, with no one to witness his sacrifice, he could not shake the feeling that the very walls he protected were crumbling, disintegrating beneath the weight of history. There was no glory in this work, no song or story sung for the night watchman. His name would never be carved into the stone of the castle, nor would his sacrifice be known to the generations that came after. He was a man who stood in silence, bound to a world that never truly saw him. He moved through the streets as a shadow, unnoticed, an invisible thread holding together a fragile world. The flicker of the lantern cast his face into sharp relief for a moment, revealing the deep lines etched into his skin, lines that spoke of sleepless nights, of watching over people who would never know his pain, his loneliness. The lantern light illuminated the empty streets, the closed doors, the silent windows where families slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the danger that hovered just beyond their reach. The night was their protector, yes, but it was also their enemy. And in this world, as in every world, darkness had its own rules. He felt the pull of something ancient, something primal. It was the knowledge that night did not just fall, it swallowed everything. The houses that slept behind their closed doors, the stables where animals rested, the flickering hearths that warmed the homes, all of it was fragile. Just one slip, one crack in the defense, and it could all vanish. But what of the night itself? What lived in the spaces between walls, in the gaps of history where no one dared look? The Watchman knew it well. The things that waited in the silence, beneath the surface of the world. A distant howl pierced the quiet, a long, mournful cry that sent a shiver down his spine. The wolves were near. He could feel it. The shadows seemed to grow darker, pressing in tighter. His fingers tightened on the spear, the familiar comfort of the cold steel now a distant memory. He turned toward the sound, eyes narrowing, searching for the source. The howl came again, closer now, a chilling reminder of the wilderness that lay just beyond the village walls, a world untouched by human hands, a world that had no place for laws or mercy. In the distance, a flicker of movement caught his eye, too quick to be human, too deliberate to be an animal. His heart raced. Was it just the wind? Was it his mind playing tricks, fatigued from endless hours of vigilance? Or was something, someone, watching him? The Watchman's grip tightened, his breath slowing as he moved forward, his footsteps barely making a sound on the cobblestones. He walked toward the edge of the square, the shadows swallowing his figure, as the lantern's flame threatened to extinguish in the cold wind. The village was still. No one stirred from their homes, no cries of alarm, no ringing of bells. He was alone, as always, in the heavy silence of the night. The flickering lantern light cast eerie shadows on the stone walls, turning them into dark, towering shapes that seemed to close in on him. Each footstep echoed louder than the last. His mind raced. What was it? Was it just the weight of his own solitude, the crushing sense that this was his fate? Or had something truly broken the fragile barrier between the known and the unknown? And yet, in that silence, in that moment between heartbeats, the tension began to ease. The Watchman paused, a sigh escaping his lips as he felt the world shift back into place. There was no danger, no wolves, no bandits, no plague, only the night and the ever-present weight of his duty. It would pass. It always did. The Watchman had no illusions about this work. He would watch, and he would wait for as long as his body would allow him. And when the sun rose, he would disappear once more into the shadows, a silent figure, forgotten, until the night called him again. As the first light of dawn began to stretch across the horizon, the village slowly stirred. The Watchman stood at the edge of the square, his silhouette barely visible against the waning night. The quiet, almost imperceptible hum of the coming day was like a promise, something he could never quite hold, but something that always came back. He lowered his spear, his task complete, for now. The village had slept in peace, its inhabitants oblivious to the invisible wall of protection that stood between them and the wilds of the world. The Watchman knew this peace was fleeting. The night would return again, as it always did, and when it did, he would be there, silent, unseen, alone. The world would never know his name. But it didn't matter. He had made his choice long ago. And for him, the darkness was both a prison and a sanctuary, where he would stand guard, forever unseen. As the sun rose higher in the sky, he disappeared into the veil of the morning mist, leaving behind only the whispers of the wind and the memory of a man who stood in silence against the ever-encroaching dark. The night was always a bit colder here, as if the very earth had forgotten how to keep warmth. The scent of damp stone and the distant aroma of wood smoke filled the air, thick with the weight of centuries past. The moon hung low, its pale light barely enough to illuminate the streets of the small medieval village. But for the Watchman, it was enough. Enough to guide his steps, enough to keep him tethered to this world, to the fleeting moments between life and death. His lantern flickered in the stillness, the flame weak against the heavy, suffocating silence that lay over the land. His feet shuffled along the cobbled streets, each step as deliberate and heavy as the one before. The cold seeped through his boots, through the layers of wool, and into his bones. But it was not the cold that haunted him tonight. It was something else, an unspoken fear that twisted in his gut, tightening with each passing hour. The village slept, unaware of the dangers that loitered in the edges of the dark. The Watchman, however, was all too aware. He had seen the shadows in the corners of the world, and now they were creeping ever closer. In the distance, the faintest sound broke the silence. A creak, a groan, something too soft to be a threat, yet too deliberate to ignore. The watchman froze. His eyes narrowed, his senses sharpened. In this work, every rustle, every whisper carried weight. A danger unseen was far worse than one clearly visible. And in the stillness, in the heart of the cold night, his heart began to beat faster, thudding against his chest like the tolling of a bell. He was a man bound by duty. His life, like the lives of those in the village, had been swept along by forces beyond his control, by wars, plagues, and the ceaseless march of time. The village walls had kept out the worst, but the dangers they faced were not always the ones that could be held at bay by stone and timber. The true dangers were the ones that seeped in quietly, like poison in the veins. Disease, hunger, betrayal, these were the threats he was sworn to guard against. And yet, there was something else in the air tonight, a threat that felt like it had been waiting, biding its time in the long, dark stretches of history. The night watchman had long since accepted the weight of his role, accepted that he would never be celebrated, never seen for the sacrifices he made. He was a shadow in a world that would never acknowledge his existence. But that was the way of things. The ones who stood in the dark, those who kept the monsters at bay, who kept the creeping terror from entering the hearts of the sleeping villagers, they were never remembered. Only those who lived in the light received their due. The watchman had come to terms with this. He had, for years, stood in the dark, his vigil unnoticed, but never unimportant. Yet tonight, the weight of his burden felt heavier than it ever had before. There was a particular ache in his chest, an unease that had not been there in years past. Perhaps it was the passing of another year, or the growing silence in the village, but it felt as though something was shifting. A quiet fear that he couldn't shake. As he walked past the stone houses, the windows dark and still, he thought of the families behind them. They were safe, for now. But for how long? He could not protect them forever, not from everything. And there was always something more, something darker that lurked just beyond the walls. He paused at the edge of the square, where the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, reaching out to swallow the last remnants of light. His eyes scanned the empty streets. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear but the wind and the distant rustling of leaves. And yet, he could feel it, a presence, barely perceptible, like a shifting in the air. He could not place it, but it was there, like a shadow standing just outside the reach of his lantern's glow. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the minutes dragging like the weight of centuries. The watchman had long ago stopped questioning why he did this, why he gave himself to the darkness, to the loneliness that came with this life. The watchman did not have the luxury of questions. His role was simple: watch, protect, remain vigilant. The villagers would not understand the sacrifices he made. How could they? They had their lives to live, their families to care for. They had no need for the burden he carried. He was invisible to them. He was part of the night, just as the shadows were, a ghost in their midst. A sudden sound broke his reverie, a low growl that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath his feet. His heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, eyes searching the dark for the source. The sound was gone as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the wind. But it lingered, its echo haunting his senses. The watchman stepped forward, slower now, each step measured, each breath calculated. His grip tightened on the shaft of his spear, the cold metal pressing into his hand, a reminder of the weapon he carried, the power he had, if only to defend himself from the things he could never truly defeat. He moved towards the edge of the village, where the dark woods lay just beyond the walls. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches twisted and reaching into the night like skeletal hands. The watchman could feel the presence of something ancient out there, something that watched him, waiting. The air was thick with it, and though he could not see it, he could feel it closing in. The light of his lantern flickered once more, as if fighting against the suffocating grip of the night. The shadows seemed to deepen, and for a moment the watchman thought he heard the faintest whisper, a voice just beyond his hearing, like a distant memory or a half-formed dream. He stopped, listening intently. But there was nothing, just the wind and the soft rustling of the trees. He was not alone. Not truly. There was something out there, beyond the village, something that would always remain a threat, no matter how hard he tried to protect his home. This world, the one the villagers lived in, was fragile. It could crumble in an instant, undone by something as insidious as a silent plague or a hidden enemy. And so, the watchman stood alone in the cold, the weight of his duty pressing heavily on him. The minutes passed, and the moon began to sink lower in the sky. The first light of dawn was on the horizon, but the night felt as though it would never end. His eyes strained in the darkness, the fatigue weighing down on him like an anchor. But he had made his vow, long ago. He would stand guard, no matter how long it took, no matter how heavy the night grew. This was his burden, and he would bear it until the last light of day broke over the village. And as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, the watchman exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging with the relief of another night survived. The village would wake soon, oblivious to the quiet terror that had brushed against the edges of their lives. But for him, the night was never truly over. It would come again, as it always did, and when it did, he would be there, silent, alone, waiting. The night pressed down like a suffocating shroud over the village. A chill sharper than any blade cut through the air, as if the earth itself had forgotten warmth. The moon, half veiled by drifting clouds, struggled to pierce the darkness, leaving the streets below in shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's mournful cry stretched across the valley, but it was swallowed by the silence that clung to the world. Beneath the weight of that darkness, only one figure moved. The night watchman, his breath misting in the frigid air, his heart suspended between life and the coming dawn. He stood at the edge of the village, back pressed against the cold stone wall, separating him from the wild beyond. His lantern flickered weakly, its flame quivering against the night's pull. Fingers stiff and numb, he gripped it tightly, unwilling to relinquish the fragile glow that kept the darkness at bay. The cold had long been his companion. Yet tonight, it seemed alive, insistent, pressing into him like a predator. His breaths came shallow, each exhale a fragile proof of life. And beneath it all, something else waited, a weight in the air, unseen, predatory. Something watched him, and he felt it deep in his bones. The village slept, wrapped in warmth and oblivion. Families behind locked doors dreamed peacefully, unaware of the solitary sentinel who shielded them from dangers they could neither see nor imagine. The distance between them and him was never so stark. They lived in light. He moved through shadow. He was their unseen guardian, and they would never know his name. A faint scraping sound, distant, deliberate, pulled his attention to the bordering woods. The twisted limbs of the trees clawed at the sky, black and skeletal. The darkness pulsed as if alive, waiting. The wolf's howl cut through the night again, closer now, sharp and urgent, as if beckoning him into the unknown. He hesitated. The cold pressed along his spine, but it was not fear of frost that held him. It was the lurking, silent terror beyond the walls. He had faced thieves, wolves, rumors of plague, but this was older, primordial, a sense that tonight the boundary between worlds had thinned, that shadows had grown teeth. One deliberate step forward, lantern swinging gently, casting flickering shapes across frozen earth. The square seemed to watch him, as though aware of the burden he carried. A low sound, soft growing, rose from the alley to his left. Wind carried the faint tang of smoke and something fouler, something rotten. His hand clenched the spear, cold metal biting his palm. Another rustle, closer. Heart pounding, breath quickening. Lantern flickered. Nothing yet moved. The air thickened with expectancy, as if the world had condensed to a single moment. Then, a shuffling from the alley. A pale figure emerged, limping, deliberate. Hunger radiated from it, pulsing in the darkness. No fear, no hesitation, only inevitability. The first light of dawn was still hours away, but the watchman knew the night was spent. Darkness had come, and now it had left him with silence and the faintest echo of a whisper. Keep watching, for what you fear is always just beyond your reach. The figure drew closer. Isolation pressed against him harder than the cold, heavier than the night itself. This vigil would linger, long after the sun rose and the villagers slept, oblivious. He would be there at dawn, but whether he would remain the same man, he could not say. The night pressed in, thick with the scent of wet earth and damp stone. The moon, half covered by clouds, cast a soft, pale light that barely broke through the dark expanse above, Shadows clung to the village like a living thing, silent and unyielding. The only sound, aside from the occasional howl of a distant wolf, was the soft shuffle of boots against the cobblestones, the rhythmic scrape of leather on stone. The night watchman moved through the streets, a solitary figure whose silhouette blended with the darkness, a ghost among the forgotten. His cloak billowed in the wind, though he barely felt the chill seeping into his bones anymore. It had been years since the cold had bothered him. His body had grown used to it, numbed by the endless nights of standing guard, of watching over a world that slumbered in peace, oblivious to the dangers that lurked just beyond their doorstep. His lantern swung in the heavy air, the weak flame casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance like wraiths across the walls of the village. There were no songs for him, no songs for the silent guardians who kept the fragile thread of peace intact. The night was a different beast altogether here, a place where fear could grow unchecked. The village, so vibrant and alive by day, now lay buried beneath the weight of the unknown. Families slept behind shuttered windows, their dreams untarnished by the fears that gnawed at the edges of the world. And in the dark, the watchman stood alone, his breath shallow in the cool air, the ever-present weight of his oath pulling at him like the tide. He had sworn to protect them, and so he did, though he knew the villagers would never thank him. They would never know the sacrifices he made, the hours spent in the dark, alone with his thoughts and the cold wind. His role was one of silence, one of invisibility. He was not meant to be seen, not meant to be remembered, but that was the price he paid, the price they all paid. The night was his only companion, a constant reminder of the duty that had bound him to this place. His hand tightened around the hilt of his spear, the cold steel offering little comfort against the chill that permeated the air. The weight of the weapon was familiar, as much a part of him as the mantle of responsibility he carried. He had been here before, countless times, standing at the edge of this village, watching over it with eyes that had seen too much. His duty had never wavered. It had been his calling, a vow taken long ago, a promise made in the quiet of night that he would never break. He had no name beyond the watchman. There was no need for one. The world had forgotten him, just as it had forgotten all the others who had come before him. The watchman moved forward, his footsteps soft against the cobblestones, each one a step further into the darkness. The village behind him was a quiet memory, and before him stretched the cold, empty streets, the walls of the houses looming like sentinels guarding secrets long buried. But the danger was not in the village, it was out there, beyond the walls. The night was a thief, stealing lives, stealing peace, stealing everything that could be taken when the world was asleep. And it was his job to ensure that it did not come for the village. A distant cry cut through the silence, the howl of a wolf, primal and chilling. The sound seemed to echo in the night, filling the empty spaces between the houses, reverberating off the stone walls. The watchman froze for a moment, his senses heightened. The howl carried with it a reminder of the wilderness just beyond the town, a wilderness where the rules of man had no sway, where the laws of civilization meant nothing. And yet, he stood firm. It was his vow, his oath, to keep the darkness at bay. He could feel the eyes of the village on him, though none of them were awake. They trusted him without knowing him, just as they trusted the walls to protect them, just as they trusted the night to pass without incident. Theirs was a trust built on ignorance, on the belief that someone would always be there to watch over them. But the night watchman knew the truth, that the darkness was a force to be reckoned with. The true battle was not fought with swords or spears, but with vigilance and patience, with an unwavering sense of duty that could not be broken. The wind picked up, sending a shiver down his spine. He paused at the edge of the square, his eyes scanning the surrounding streets, every shadow, every corner. It was here, at the crossroads between the known and the unknown, that the watchman felt the weight of his oath most deeply. This was the moment he lived for. The moment when danger could arrive without warning, when the silence was both a blessing and a curse. And in that silence, he knew the truth. His duty was not to the village, not to the people who slept soundly in their beds. His duty was to the night itself, to the forces that moved unseen in the dark, waiting for the moment when they could slip through the cracks. A soft rustling broke the silence. The watchman's hand instinctively tightened on his spear. Was it a wolf, a bandit, or something else entirely? The world seemed to contract around him, the air growing heavier, more suffocating. He moved toward the sound, his steps deliberate, his breath steady. The lantern light flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the village. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the promise of something that could change everything in an instant. He rounded the corner of a building, his eyes narrowing, scanning the darkness. The street was empty, save for the swaying trees at the edge of the village. The rustling had stopped. The watchman stood still, his body tense, every muscle on alert. He listened for any sign of movement, for any hint of danger. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then, a low creak. A door opening, or was it closing? The watchman turned, but there was nothing. Only the stillness, the absolute silence that seemed to echo louder than anything else. He exhaled slowly, lowering his spear. The danger had passed, or perhaps it had never been there at all. But the watchman knew that was the nature of his work, the constant vigilance, the feeling of something lurking just out of reach. The night was never truly quiet, never truly still. There was always something waiting. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the darkened sky, the watchman knew his shift was ending. But his duty was not over. It never truly ended. The village would wake soon, and they would never know the fear he had stood against, the burden he had carried alone. But it didn't matter. He would remain forgotten, his name lost to time, his sacrifice buried in the shadows. But his oath would stand. The watchman turned, his back to the rising sun, his shoulders heavy, but his spirit resolute. The village was safe for now. But the night would come again, and when it did, he would be there standing guard, as he always had, as he always would. Silent, invisible, ever watchful, forever alone. The night was impossibly still, the kind of quiet that seemed to stretch the very fabric of time. The kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, weighing on the chest like an invisible hand. Beneath a dark sky streaked with faint wisps of clouds, the village lay hidden in the embrace of darkness, its cobblestone streets silent and empty, the windows of the homes shuttered tight against the encroaching night. And yet, through that vast silence, there was one figure moving, a solitary shadow that walked with purpose, a figure as much a part of the night as the shadows themselves. The night watchman moved like a whisper through the streets, his dark cloak billowing in the wind, his eyes scanning the stillness. His lantern swung from his hand, casting flickering light that struggled to hold back the all-consuming dark. The flame wavered in the cold air, as if it too were unsure whether to continue its battle against the inevitable darkness or simply succumb. Yet he carried it still, the small flickering flame a beacon, not for himself, but for those who slept soundly in their beds, unaware of the danger that lurked beyond their walls. The village was not much different from the others he had known. The same old houses, the same well-worn roads, the same gentle lull of the wind through the trees. But to the watchman, it was all different. Each night was a new chapter in a book written in silence and sacrifice. Every step he took along the cobblestones, every breath of cold air that burned his lungs, was part of a story that no one would ever read. He was the unsung hero, the invisible protector whose name would never be spoken in the warmth of the hearth, whose efforts would fade with the dawn, unnoticed by those he swore to defend. He had never asked for this role, but it had been given to him long ago, a role passed down through generations, a role that was not one of glory or celebration, but one of constant vigilance and solitude. He was a ghost in the lives of those he watched over, never seen, never remembered, but always there, standing in the dark, watching for what might come to break their fragile peace. The watchman did not complain, for he had long learned that his service was not for recognition, not for thanks. It was for duty alone. As he walked past the houses, he imagined the lives that were hidden behind those walls. The mothers who slept with their children tucked under their blankets, the men who rested after a long day's labor, the families who would never know how close they came to danger, how thin the thread of their safety had become. It was his job to ensure that the night would pass quietly, that the village would awaken to another day, its world unbroken, its peace intact. But the watchman knew better than anyone that peace was fragile. And the night, dark and unforgiving, was always ready to test it. He stopped near the village well, where the flickering light of his lantern cast long shadows across the stones. There was something in the air tonight, a tension that he couldn't quite place. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of smoke, a smell that seemed out of place here. His instincts, honed over countless nights of vigilance, prickled at the edges of his mind. He had seen enough in his years of service to know that nothing in the night was truly still. There were always whispers in the wind, always secrets hidden in the shadows. And though he could not see them, he could feel them, the dangers that crept in when no one was watching. A distant sound interrupted the stillness, a soft rustling in the trees. The watchman turned, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing. There, just at the edge of the forest, the trees seemed to sway with a life of their own, their branches twisting and curling in unnatural ways. The shadows there were deeper, darker than they should have been. He could feel them, pressing in on him from all sides, but the night was still. The sound had ceased, leaving only the heavy silence in its wake. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his breath, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in his chest. But it was there, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The village was asleep, yes, but the world beyond was awake, and the watchman had long since learned that the dangers outside the walls never truly slept. He could feel it in the wind, in the whispering trees, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The things in the night were patient. They waited. The watchman moved again, his feet dragging slightly, heavy from years of service, from the weight of solitude that clung to him like a second skin. His spear was held loosely in his hand, a comforting weight. He had carried it for so long, it had become part of him, a symbol of the oath he had sworn. The oath to protect the people who would never know his name, never acknowledge the sacrifices he made. But that was the nature of his work, silent, unseen, and unthanked. He had stood here in the dark before, many times, and yet tonight felt different. The air was thick with something else, something ancient, something that reached out from the depths of time itself. The world beyond these walls, the forests and the hills, held its own secrets, secrets that the village would never know, secrets that had long since been forgotten. But the watchman remembered. He remembered the dangers that once ruled these lands, the wild beasts, the marauders, the forces of nature that had no mercy. And now, as then, his duty was clear. He paused at the farthest edge of the village, where the trees grew close to the wall, their branches reaching out like dark fingers. The wind had died down again, leaving behind an eerie calm. The lantern's light cast strange shapes across the trees, the shadows bending and shifting as if alive. The watchman's breath slowed, his grip tightening on his spear as he scanned the shadows. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, just a flicker, a brief distortion in the dark. But it was gone before he could be certain. The village slept on, unaware of the dangers that prowled at the edges of their world. They would wake in the morning, their lives unchanged, their hearts light, their minds untroubled. But for the watchman, the night was never truly over. The world he watched over was fragile, its peace a delicate thing, and it was his burden to carry, night after night. The village would never know how close it came to the edge, how thin the line was between peace and chaos. And so the watchman stood, silent and unseen, a shadow among shadows, the only thing standing between the village and the darkness beyond. As the first light of dawn began to break, he turned and disappeared into the veil of morning mist, his duty for the night done, but never truly finished. For the night would return again, and when it did, he would be there, always, forever. The moon was nothing more than a sliver in the sky, swallowed by the endless expanse of black above. The wind had fallen quiet, but the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The only sound that broke the stillness was the soft, rhythmic crunch of boots on wet cobblestones, the sound of a lone figure walking through a village that had long since fallen silent. The night watchman moved through the streets, his cloak billowing behind him, his lantern swinging low at his side, its flickering light casting long, warped shadows across the stone walls. He walked without hurry, his steps measured, deliberate. There was no rush. There never was. The night, after all, was long, and his duty was endless. He had been walking these same paths for years, yet tonight there was a weight in the air that he could not shake. The streets, usually empty at this hour, felt more silent than ever. The houses he passed, dark and closed off from the world, seemed to loom larger, their walls heavy with secrets that the watchman would never know. He did not mind. He did not expect to be remembered. He did not need recognition. His only task was to keep them safe, to stand between them and the darkness that stretched beyond the walls. He reached the edge of the village, where the houses gave way to the forest. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their limbs bare and twisted like the fingers of long-forgotten spirits. The wind rustled through the branches, but even that sound seemed muffled, as though the night itself had grown weary of making noise. The watchman paused at the edge of the forest, his eyes scanning the tree line, his senses alert. He had always felt it more strongly here. The pull of something ancient, something wild that lingered just beyond the walls of the village. A faint rustling stirred in the underbrush, and the watchman's body went rigid. It was the sound of something moving in the darkness, something not quite right, something too quiet to be natural. He drew in a slow, steady breath, tightening his grip on the spear that hung at his side. It was always in the stillness that danger found its way in. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, to listen to the silence that often held more truth than the noise of the world. And tonight, the silence spoke of something waiting, something watching. The lantern's flame sputtered in the wind, its weak light flickering, as if struggling to stay alive. The watchman's breath caught in his throat for a moment as the darkness seemed to press in closer, tightening around him. But he did not flinch. This was his duty. This was his oath. He had taken it long ago, and it had bound him to this place, to this world of shadows and forgotten whispers. There was no turning back. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the darkened edge of the trees. His every movement was deliberate, as though he was moving through a dream, one foot in front of the other, until the ground beneath his boots seemed to give way to something softer, something more treacherous. The air grew colder, sharper, as he crossed into the forest's embrace, the darkness closing in around him like the jaws of some unseen beast. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches creaking with an ancient groan. The rustling grew louder now, the sounds of something, or someone, moving through the underbrush just ahead. The watchman's heart beat faster, his pulse quickening as the shadows seemed to deepen, to wrap around him like a suffocating blanket. But he did not stop. His oath would not let him stop. He was the village's unseen protector, the one who stood between them and the dangers that never rested. He was the watcher in the dark, the one whose name would never be spoken aloud. He was the one who kept the night at bay. A figure emerged from the shadows, a shape, human in form, but too tall, too thin to be anything natural. The watchman's breath caught, his grip tightening on his spear as the figure stepped closer, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the world holding its breath as the two figures faced each other in the dark. The forest around them was silent now, as if it too was waiting, watching. The figure did not speak, it did not move, but the air between them seemed charged with something, an unseen tension, a heaviness that weighed on the watchman's shoulders. He had faced many things in his time as the night watchman, wolves, bandits, whispers of plague, but nothing like this. The figure before him seemed to be made of the night itself, as if it had been born from the very darkness it walked through. And yet, it was not a creature of the forest. It was something older, something forgotten, and it knew his name without ever having spoken it. "You are alone," the figure said at last, its voice soft, barely a whisper on the wind. The watchman did not answer. He stood still, his grip on his spear unwavering, his body taut with the quiet fury of a man whose vow could not be broken. The figure took a step closer, and in the dim light of the lantern, the watchman could make out the pale glint of something in its hand, something sharp, something dangerous. But the watchman did not flinch. He had made his oath, and his oath would see him through. The figure's lips curled into a faint, hollow smile. "The night will always return," it said, its voice laced with something that sounded almost like pity. "No matter how long you stand in its way, it will always return." The words hung in the air like a curse, the truth of them settling deep into the watchman's chest. But still, He did not move. His shoulders were heavy, but his resolve was heavier. This was his life. This was his duty. He was the last line of defense, the one who would stand watch while the world slept, while the village remained oblivious to the danger that lived just outside their walls. The night would always return, yes, but so would he. He had made his vow, and nothing would take it from him. Without a word, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The watchman stood in the cold, the silence pressing against him, the weight of his oath heavy on his shoulders. The rustling in the trees died down, the night once again settling into its stillness. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of his promise echo in the cold night air. The world would never know his name, but it didn't matter. He would always be here, standing guard, standing watch. The darkness would return, as it always did. And when it did, the watchman would be waiting, silent, alone, the unseen protector of a village that would never remember him, but always need him. The moon hung low in the sky, shrouded by a veil of thick, roiling clouds that seemed to churn with an unease of their own. The air was heavy, pregnant with the promise of a storm that never came, the silence pressing down like the weight of an ancient curse. A cold wind stirred the trees at the edge of the village, their branches groaning under its force, yet nothing else moved. The streets were empty, the houses dark and still. No light filtered through the narrow, cap-shuttered windows. No voices, no sounds of life. Only the deep, unyielding quiet of a world untouched by time. It was in this stillness that the night watchman walked, his every step deliberate, his presence as much a part of the darkness as the shadows themselves. His cloak trailed behind him like a whispered secret, the frayed edges stirring in the wind, the dim glow of his lantern casting flickering, disjointed shadows across the cobblestones. The flame within the lantern sputtered but held on, a small, fragile light struggling against the overwhelming dark. His eyes, sharp and trained through years of sleepless nights, scanned the village with precision. Each house, each street corner, each alleyway held the same threatening silence. But the watchman knew better. The silence was not peace. It was a prelude, a warning. There was always something lurking in the quiet spaces, something waiting for the villagers to let their guard down. And that was where he came in. The watchman, the silent protector, the unseen hand that kept the darkness at bay. He had always walked alone. It was a life that had been thrust upon him, an oath taken long ago when he had first stood in this very village, as young as the dawn. His duty was clear, to watch over those who slept, to stand between them and the dangers that slipped in unnoticed. They would never know the weight he carried, the long hours spent in the cold and dark, his senses straining for any sign of movement. But that was how it was meant to be. He was the ghost in the night, the guardian they never saw but always needed. And yet, even now, after so many years, the solitude of it all still felt like a wound he could never fully heal. He paused at the edge of the village square, his lantern casting a soft, trembling light over the worn stone. His breath rose in puffs of fog, the chills settling into his bones, but he stood motionless, his senses alert. There was something in the air tonight, a shift in the stillness, a tension that seemed to hang heavier than the wind. It was the feeling of being watched, a presence just beyond his reach. The trees rustled faintly, as though someone or something was moving through them, but there was no sound of footsteps, only the wind. And yet, he knew. He had learned long ago that it was never the obvious dangers that one needed to fear. It was the things unseen, the things that thrived in the shadows. The faintest noise broke the silence. The creak of a door? A whisper in the wind? His heart quickened, and his fingers tightened around the lantern's handle. The village was still asleep, its inhabitants unaware of the world that existed just outside their doorframes. A world where dangers walked unnoticed, where unseen forces gathered in the dark corners of the world. But the watchman had been standing guard for so long, he knew the rhythm of the night, the pulse of its heartbeat. And tonight, something was different. Something had shifted. His eyes darted toward the edge of the village, where the woods began. The trees loomed dark, their twisted branches like fingers stretching into the sky. The shadows beneath them seemed to move, like whispers passing through the branches. There was no sound, not a rustle of leaves, no animal calls. only the hollow emptiness of the forest stretching beyond. And it was there, in the darkness, that the watchman could feel it most, the pull of something ancient, something untouchable. The wilderness beyond the walls had never been fully conquered. It was a place of ghosts and forgotten fears, and the watchman knew that one day those fears would come for the village. He gripped his spear tighter, its cold metal familiar beneath his fingers. The world seemed to narrow as he stepped forward, each movement deliberate. His heart was steady, his breath measured. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. The watchman had never faltered, not once in all the years of his service. His path had been set long ago, and it had brought him here, night after night, standing guard in the unacknowledged shadows. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold swept through him. The air felt thick, the world pressing in, suffocating him with its silence. The rustling at the edge of the trees had stopped. Everything was still. But the tension remained, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of view. The watchman's instincts screamed at him to look, to search the woods more thoroughly. He stepped closer to the tree line, the familiar weight of his spear a comfort against the growing dread in his chest. There it was again, a soft movement, a fleeting shape in the dark. His breath caught in his throat. A figure, just a glimpse of movement between the trees. Not a man, not a wolf, but something else. Something that did not belong to this world. His heart thundered in his chest as he moved forward, the lantern's flickering light barely enough to reveal the full shape of the forest around him. The shadows pressed in tighter, a veil of darkness that felt alive, breathing. And there, at the very edge of the trees, something stirred again. The figure was closer now. Not quite visible, but he could feel it. He could feel the presence like a weight on his chest. His grip on the spear tightened until his knuckles whitened, his body ready to spring into action. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness as though it had never existed at all. The watchman stood frozen for a long moment, his senses alive with the aftermath of what had just happened. The air seemed to crackle with energy, but there was no sign of the figure now. No footprints in the dirt, no sounds in the trees, only the quiet, only the waiting. He exhaled slowly, his pulse still racing in his veins. It had passed. Whatever it was, it had gone. But the watchman knew it was not over. The night would never truly end. The darkness would always return, and it would always be waiting. As the first light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, the watchman turned back toward the village. The shadows began to fade, the world shifting from night to day. But the feeling of dread, the feeling of something unseen, lingered. His vigil was not done. It would never be done. The village would wake soon, and they would be safe, but only for another day. The watchman would remain, standing in the spaces between light and dark, between known and unknown. Silent, unseen, forever watching. The wind howled through the village, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the cold that accompanied it. The dark sky above was a swirling canvas of gray and black, the clouds thick with the promise of a storm that had not yet arrived. The village was eerily still, the usual sounds of life, voices, laughter, the soft clatter of hooves on cobblestone, completely absent. A heavy silence had settled over the streets, as though the entire world had been placed under a spell. Only one figure moved through the shadows, the night watchman, his silhouette cutting through the darkness, a lone guardian against the gathering storm. His cloak billowed behind him, the fabric whispering against the stone as he walked, each footfall deliberate and steady. The light of his lantern cast faint, flickering shadows across the empty streets, painting the buildings in ghostly hues. The night was cold, the kind of biting chill that made the bones ache, but the watchman did not feel it. The cold had long since become part of him, like the weight of the oath he had taken all those years ago. His task was not to feel the elements or the burden of the passing years. His task was to stand between the village and whatever dangers prowled just beyond their walls. The wind tugged at his cloak, and his eyes, sharp and ever watchful, scanned the village square, the alleys, and the edges where the trees began. He had walked these streets countless times before, but tonight there was a tension in the air, a sense of something waiting just beyond the horizon. It was the kind of feeling that sent a shiver down his spine, the kind that made every creak of the buildings, every whisper of the wind, seem like a warning. The lantern's light flickered briefly before steadying again, casting longer shadows on the stone as he moved. The watchman had never been one for superstition, but the quiet was unsettling tonight. He could almost hear the distant echoes of something long gone, a memory of the past that still haunted these streets. The village had seen its fair share of turmoil, plagues, wars, famine, but there was always something worse out there in the dark. Something that could never be fully prepared for, something that only he, the solitary figure in the night, could confront. He passed the familiar houses, their windows dark, their shutters closed tight. Behind those doors, families slept unaware, oblivious to the sacrifice made by the watchmen standing outside. To them, the night was a time of peace, a time to rest. But the watchman knew better. He knew that the night was not a time for rest. It was a time for vigilance, for waiting. And that was the heavy burden he carried each night. The villagers would never see his watch, never thank him for the countless hours spent keeping the darkness at bay. They would never know what it cost him, the solitude, the endless nights of watching, the weight of responsibility that pressed down on his shoulders like a mountain. A distant howl cut through the night, sending a chill down the watchman's spine. It was the cry of a wolf, sharp and mournful, but it wasn't the howl that unsettled him. It was the way it seemed to echo, reverberating through the empty streets and against the stone walls, as if calling to something, or someone, out there in the dark. The watchman paused, his hand instinctively tightening around the lantern's handle, his senses sharp. The sound faded into the distance, but the feeling of something watching him, waiting, remained. He moved toward the edge of the village, where the trees began and the world beyond the walls lay in wait. The forest stood dark and still, the trees like silent sentinels, their branches twisting against the wind. The watchman stopped at the border, his lantern casting a pale, uncertain light on the dense underbrush. The path beyond was barely visible, swallowed by the thick shadows of the trees. He knew that beyond this edge lay a world that had never been fully conquered by man. A world of wolves, bandits, and worse, things far older and more dangerous than anything the villagers could imagine. The watchman's grip tightened on the spear at his side. He had faced wolves before, the occasional bandit, and even whispers of plagues that had swept through the land. But this was different. He could feel it in the air, a shift in the night, a sense that something ancient and dangerous stirred just beyond the borders of the village. It wasn't the familiar threat of wolves or outlaws. It was something darker, something older, something that had been lying in wait for centuries. Perhaps longer. A gust of wind swept through the trees, sending a shiver through the watchman's body. He looked out over the dark forest, his breath visible in the air as he exhaled slowly, his chest tight with the weight of his responsibility. His purpose was clear: to protect the village, to keep the darkness at bay. But tonight, as the wind howled and the shadows seemed to stretch further than before, he wondered how long he could keep this up. How long could he stand guard against an enemy he could not see, one that had no face, no form, but that had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to strike? The rustling in the distance began again, low and soft, like footsteps in the underbrush. The watchman's heart quickened as he turned, eyes searching the darkness, scanning the trees, the edges of the forest, the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. But there was nothing. Only the wind and the rustling of leaves. Yet the feeling remained, the presence of something just out of reach, something that had been watching him, waiting. The watchman exhaled slowly, his fingers still tight on the handle of the lantern, his body poised and ready to face whatever might come from the darkness. The night would never end. It would always return, and so would he. It was his duty, his burden. And no matter how long the watchman stood, no matter how long the night stretched on, he would never be free of it. As the first faint light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the village slowly stirred from its deep slumber, unaware of the dangers that had lurked at the edges of their world. The watchman turned back toward the village, the weight of the night's silence lifting slightly as the first light touched the village walls. His shift was over. For now. The villagers would wake, and they would carry on with their lives as if the darkness had never been. But the watchman knew better. He knew that the night would always come again, and when it did, he would be there, standing alone against it, his oath unbroken. Silent, unseen, forever burdened by the weight of his duty.